And now we're recording it, and I think the people who dropped in are already here. So everyone, welcome to this talk with Saide Mobayed, PhD candidate in sociology at Cambridge, who is going to introduce femicide and all her knowledge that she collected over the years. She will share with us. Before I hand over to Saide, I will just let Mimi say some words about Verein Simone. For those of you who are here and know us already, as an organization, we actually usually do our talks in German, since we're an Austrian civil society organization. But this time it will be in English. But that's an exception because Saide does it in English. So yeah, Mimi, maybe if you want to say something.
Yeah, we try our best English. Yeah, welcome from me too. It's cool that so many people joined tonight. And yeah, like you said before we jump into the topic, I will say some words about our organization. And we're 6 women who gathered to work against patriarchal structures. And our main goal was actually to go into schools and talk to students about gender roles and discriminations. But in 2019, we started to do the Simone Stammtische, which is translated to regular tables. I think it's more an expression in German. And the concept is to invite an expert on a certain topic and then to provide an open space to ask questions and discuss. And tonight we're trying to do that over Zoom, and we hope it works just as fine as in live. Yeah, and then I will get back to Clara. You have to unmute yourself.
Unmute yourself. Yes, so basically I got to know Saide through friends actually, but relatively quickly found out what you're doing, Saide, and your research. You have been researching, or Saide has been researching a lot about femicide, and since we from Verein Simone want to keep our approach to gender sensitization in society intersectional, but also not that Eurocentric, I thought that it was a perfect opportunity for us to actually have someone who has researched on femicide in another country than Europe, or another country outside of Europe and the EU. You have been researching about comparison of data and the collection of data, which is really important in order to actually say something about the crime itself. In the case of Mexico. So today we're going to hear about what femicide actually is, and the ongoing challenges on how we actually provide knowledge and collect knowledge about the crime. So yeah, I hand over the floor to you, Saide, and your fantastic presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Clara and Miriam, for the invitation and for opening this space to discuss a topic that, as you both said, I've been researching on for quite some time now. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is give you an overview of what femicide is, the global challenges that come with trying to transnationalize the concept, and another layer of challenges, which is data comparison. And since now we live in the trope of turning data into action, I think it's very important to try to sort of deconstruct what this means. And it's also important to mention where I'm coming from. So this perspective that I will give to you tonight comes from the sociology of knowledge, particularly from a feminist and decolonial perspective, digital sociology, and the sociology of quantification. So those are the subdisciplines within my field that I am placing myself on my research. So without further ado. So I decided to divide the presentation in acts. So trying to paint a coherent picture of this topic. So in the first act, what I'm going to explain to you is the conundrum between the concept femicide and feminicidio, and now what UNODC has been using, which is the gender-related killing of women. So femicide was publicly enunciated for the first time by Diana Russell, who's a very prominent feminist, at the International Tribunal on Crimes Against Women in Brussels in 1976. So this was the first time, let's say, that the concept was, enunciated or openly spoken about. And she defined it then as the killing of females by males because they are females. This was the definition that she gave. 20 years later, at the border between Mexico and the US in Ciudad Juarez, a systematic phenomenon where women were being abducted and killed in the public space started to emerge. This was the mid-90s, after the NAFTA agreement was signed, and there's a whole neoliberal discussion around why femicides started to occur systematically in this specific geographical space. In this moment, the concept repoliticized into feminicidio, and there is a place-based epistemological notion with feminicidio. And the main idea behind, or the main difference between femicide and feminicidio, is the fact that in the Mexican context, the state played an important role by omitting, neglecting, and even colluding in the violent crimes against women. So to go deeper into these tensions and frictions is important, as it might give us an insight into the subsequent practices of quantification that resulted from the introduction of this political concept. So this being said, there is one definition I like to use in my research, and it's a definition given by Rosalinda Fregoso and Cynthia Bejarano. And I will share this with you in case, like, for us to agree, or for you to be aware of which definition I am coming from. So I open quote, "First, we defined feminicide as the murders of women and girls founded on a gender power structure. Second, feminicide is gender-based violence that is both public and private, implicating both the state, directly or indirectly, and individual perpetrators, private or state actors. It encompasses systematic, widespread, and everyday interpersonal violence. Third, feminicide is systemic violence rooted in social, political, economic, and cultural inequalities. In this sense, the focus of our analysis is not just gender, but also on the intersection of gender dynamics with cruelties of racism and economic injustices in local as well as global context." So even though they wrote this in 2010, intersectionality was still, they were using intersectionality to define femicide. And here I also like to add what the former UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls, Rashida Manhoo, stressed on this topic. And she said, "We should understand femicide or feminicide as a continuum of violence, meaning not only the multiple forms of discrimination and oppression which women around the world face, but also the culture of impunity that continues to exist. Here it is important to stress that the killing of a woman is the last step in a long spiral of violence that women are often embedded in, particularly due to the pervasiveness of patriarchal power structures." Recently, around 2013, the UN started to use the gender-related killing of women and girls to refer to femicide and feminicide. And the reason behind is that in the opinion of some, femicide or feminicide is a very politically contested concept. So they conceive gender-related killing of women and girls as a more neutral type of concept. This is debatable, but in my research, this is why I like to use it, as you see, with the parentheses of feminicide, to include both concepts and to render both concepts as equally valuable. And here I'd like to bring this quote from Gusini, which says, "Our concepts are living memory." So digging into a concept, or how a concept emerges, how a concept is shared, valued, transnational, it tells us a lot about the social, and tells us a lot about the cultural, the political, and many other layers of analysis. So in this sense, the femicide equation, it's formed by the political. And here I'd like to bring again a quote from Rashida Manhoo, who says, "The terms femicide and feminicide have emerged as part of a struggle by the women's rights movements to name women's experiences and to create a form of resistance to this fatal form of violence." Here, it is important to mention as well that the reason why feminists in Latin America incorporated feminicide and used this concept is also to distance themselves into the Western or Northern epistemes on femicide. And it's to say, we have unstable states. Our access to justice is very different than yours. And in Latin America, violence against women and girls has been a really strong entry point for women's rights. And this is really clear when we look at the encuentros, which is women gathering in Latin America during the 70s, 80s, 90s, and sort of the whole UN decade on women. And you can see there the frictions between Northern and Southern feminists, and then why, for us, Latin American violence against women and girls has been also a really big entry point into enunciating our own narratives of violence. So femicide became a paradigm as well. So this is another quote from a scholar who says, an analysis of the murder of women requires an analysis through the paradigm of feminicide, which means that we now need to look into intentional killing of women differently. And it is global at the moment, right? And this quote, we are all aware that femicide remains a global concern. I bring it in because that's part of or one of the layers of my research that I'm really interested in. What is the global? What do we consider the global? And who's actually naming the global as such? So in the second act, I present what I call the global archaeology of femicide, which is I digged into various documents and tried to see how this concept started to permeate different structures and spheres. And just to give you an illustrative example, the graph that you see on your left, it's the expansion of the concept femicide and feminicide within the UN document. So we see the exponential graph and the exponential interest from 97 up until I think it's 2016. And on your right, you see the worldwide interest over time of the query feminicidio. This is on Google Trends. So as you see quite clearly in this graph, femicide became a global issue that demands action. And the very fact that we're all reunited here, interested in knowing what femicide is, means that there's been a leverage and pushing forward to this concept. Then this led into, oh, we need global data on femicide. And here actually going deeper into how we started to collect data on femicide is fascinating. And if you go to the documents as well and you see how it's being framed, it's really interesting. So I did that. I dig into how femicide was being discussed in early documents in the UN, for example. So since 2006, the UN started to press on the need for data on violence against women and girls, and femicide was always part of the narrative of we need data, we need data, we need data. And Sally Engel-Mary, in a great book that's called The Seductions of Quantification, does also like an in-depth research into who is actually deciding what data is counting and how are these numbers being rendered comparable. So in 2006, the United Nations General Assembly said, okay, gather data on femicide. And this has led into so many other studies and public policies and programs and so on. And the latest one that we have is the 2019 UNODC Global Study on Homicide, the gender-related killing of women and girls. And I'm going to go a little bit more into this. So, as I said before, with the seductions of quantification, in my research, I start by saying that quantification is a method, is an act of measuring, is an act of judging, of valuing, of ordering, and of prioritizing, and of recognizing. And quantifying not only describes, but perhaps more bluntly produces the reality it aims to understand. It is both technical and practical. This means that you need special instruments to measure what you need to measure, but you also need convention and agreement, and that's the social practice around quantifying. So in this sense, practices of quantification involve a complex interaction between humans and non-humans and non-human entities as well. So it's not just humans who are collecting, but it's also the role of the survey, the role of the computer, the role of programs such as R processing this data. And in my research, I'm interviewing people now that are doing these global comparisons. And it's unbelievable to trace the process when a woman dies up until the moment it becomes a statistic. the amount of hands and people and machines that go before and that are part of that knowledge production is quite honestly very ungraspable. So then we have tropes such as fast facts. 1 in every 3 women suffer violence. 10 women in Mexico die every day. And we have this pressing need to quantify, right? So what I did in order to try to get a better sense of how we're transnationally comparing, and when I say transnational, I mean the comparison between local, national, and global. I put I like to frame it like I put different databases into conversation. So the first one I'm showing you here is the regional data on feminicide from the ECLAC, which is the Economic Commission on Latin America by the UN. And here it's also important to mention that so far only 18 countries in Latin America have the concept or the category of feminicide in their judicial, prosecutorial, statistical, or other state institutions. So Latin America is the only region worldwide which has included femicide, either as a penal category or as a statistical category. The ECAC has done lots of work and effort into trying to come with comparative numbers on this. However, there is this big tension between intimate partner femicide and intentional homicide and femicide. So these numbers that you see here in this graph belong to these 3 categories. And actually, in this late report of 2019, the ECLAC acknowledges that the regional averages cannot be calculated owing to the heterogeneity of national data sources and methodologies. So the ECLAC already acknowledges the difficulty of creating a comparative data process within the region. UNICEF has also, as I said, given to us the first attempt to create global data on feminicide, yet it's reduced to intimate partner feminicide. And this is important to mention, and they acknowledge this, and it's also relevant to say that this is just the beginning, but there are many other types of killings, intentional killings of women who are being left out. And the reason why is Ale just stopped into the screen. The reason why it is important to mention this is because for the data to be rendered comparable, we need to know the sex of both, the biological assigned sex at birth of both the victim and the perpetrator. This happens only in states with strong institutions. In Mexico, our dark figure overpasses 90%, which means that many of our crimes are either unreported or they never reach a sentence. So for us, it's very hard to come with specific data on victims and perpetrators due to the weak institutions. So this is where I come to the 4th act, which is when numbers don't add up, right? And this, I mentioned at the beginning, who counts or what counts. And there is hope in the narrative that I am describing here. It's not all bad. So what I'm trying to do is I'm analyzing how this data is being contested by data activism. And what you see here on your screen are a couple of maps and also an Excel sheet of data activists worldwide who are coming up with their own data collection and their own ways of quantifying and categorizing feminicide. The first one is in Mexico, the second one is in Australia, the third one is in Uruguay, the 4th one, so I think we can do it, yeah, so Mexico, Australia, Uruguay, Turkey, and this is Colombia. So women, there's been, honestly, it's really impressive how rapid this has evolved. So women all around the world are doing their own data collection processes, and with the use of Google Maps and Google Alerts. So unfortunately, this only tells us narratives around what the media reports, and we all know how biased the media is. Yet there is another way of showing these numbers which matters. And I'm going to particularly explain, as Clara mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, the case of Mexico. So This infographic here is quite interesting because it shows really well the frictions that I've been mentioning to you, but from within the nation state. So here it says, do we know how to count feminicides in Mexico? And they're portraying different graphs. So one of them comes from the National Statistic Office. The other one comes from the prosecutorial, not sure I'm pronouncing this correctly, office. And then these are the maps of Maria Salguero, who's the most famous data activist we have in Mexico. And as you see here, all the numbers are different. So they ask, who do we believe in? And then we have other sort of narratives, such as 10 women die every day in Mexico. There are, however, really good reports as well coming from local NGOs or national NGOs who are trying to chew for us what it means to collect data and the challenges that the Mexican nation state has faced to collect this data. And just like to give you a brief, I mean, the topic it can be like very, very extensive, but I don't want to talk for the entire hours. I would like to get a discussion, but just to give you an overview. So in 2007, there's the national law that says we need data on feminicide. States, we're a federation, so each state has its own state penal code. So say, okay, we need to start collecting data on feminicide. This starts happening 3-5 years later. So 2012, 2013, states start to come up with the category of feminicide within their penal code, which then translates into the statistical code as well. And it's not until 2017, so this is almost 10 years after the law was enacted, into 2017 that we have a comparison of the 32 states. So this means that if we aim to have a longitudinal comparison of feminicide, it's almost impossible. We need to go back again to intentional killing of women because the category suddenly emerged. So suddenly you have states which have over 150% more feminicides from one year to the other. So one could argue, okay, so has violence increased to that extent? And you respond, well, no. The thing is that we are counting differently now. And I bring this report, the Data Cívica report and the Mapas of Maria Salguero into this conversation that I was talking about, different data sets, because they both offer really good insights into what has changed in Mexico. And if we are to place the Mexican context within the global context that we saw from UNODC, we can tell that the reality of violence is very, very different. And I'll tell you more when we go through the graphs. So this was a report published in 2019, a fantastic report, which says like keys to understand and prevent the killing of women in Mexico. And this graph that we have here on the right shows the percentage of homicides in Mexico based on the method of the killing of sex of the victim. And so as we see, women are still killed more. Yeah, sorry, so that might be a little bit small, but they are killed more with other. This is men, and this is gunfire. This is women. They're gunfire. So as we see, men are killed more with gunfire.
Can you maybe, because it's hard to read what the colors say or what crimes it is. Could you read out what the different colors say?
Yeah, sorry, I just need to make it bigger myself. Yeah, so this one says firearm. Then this is not specified. This light color is choking or suffocating. So as we see, women die more choked or suffocated. And then this means a sharp object. So this, for example, this graph does correlate with global trends, which mean that more women die with use of other objects than guns. Yet in Mexico, there has been, as you see here, the increase of the amount of women that have been killed by guns is a very important peak, and I'll tell you why in a moment. So this is how women are dying and how, in comparison to how men are dying. And this one is based on the place, on where women are dying and where men are dying. And here it's very small, but mostly is not specified. Other, oh yeah. So this is the home. We can see that more women die at home, and this is the public space. So more men die in the public space, less men die at home. That's we know this. However, see again the trend, how here in after 2008, it's increasing so much. In this other graph, also done by La Pacifica, we can see as well how the peak rises after 2008 for both men. This is only for women, sorry, and this is the household, so the killing in the household and the killing in the public space, how much it has increased. So one trend that they've discovered is that the killing of women in the private space, in their household, has remained the same. With little variation. Women are still in danger at home. However, women are more in danger now in the public space, and this is due to the war on drugs that was launched in 2009. And this has the repercussions have been immense, both for men and women. But this has changed the dynamic of how we understand violence and how we understand feminicides, actually. And given the pace in which the state collects statistics, and given also the categories that the state brings into discussion with statistics, that's not reflected in the official data yet. However, when we see this is a graph by Maria Salguero, the data activist, that tries to sort of portray a different way of categorizing the killings. And this is violence that occurred in the context of the pandemic from March 16th to April 30th. Again, the femicides were collected via media reports, and this big chunk here that she framed as organized crime. So as we see in her data, the majority of the killings in this period were due to organized crime. This is family violence, and this is the public space. She mentions this caveat quite often that regularly intimate partner feminicides are not covered by the press. So it's mostly this other type of killings. Yet it's important to take into consideration as well. This other graph that she shows is who killed the woman. So mostly is unknown, so not necessarily family members. And then this big chunk here, 21% is sicarios, or in English, hitman, which are related to the drug war, drug cartel, and so on, and armed commandos as well. So 63% are unknown, not family members, and or intimate partner, sorry. And then this 21% relates to drug gangs, cartels, and so on. And finally, this one relates as well to the mode of killing, how they died. And as we see, this 53% is gunshot. So this is another trend that's happening in Mexico. Women are dying using like choking and other forms of violence, yet the use of firearms has also increased. So women are also dying in this way. So this is, I know it's a lot to process and a lot of food for thought, but in the final act, what I want to share with you is what have we learned and where should we go? And I say this both as like having a foot on civil society and also having a foot within research and academia, which is where I am located at the moment. So the first one is context matters. And it matters deeply when we think about violence, because this has come in my interviews as well. The crime fear that we have as women when we're born in Mexico, irrespective of your intersectionality, is very different than the one women that have been born in stable democracies have. So rarely do you hop into a taxi when you're living in Vienna and you fear that you might get raped then on the spot. And for us, women in Mexico, we're constantly conditioned in the public space by this crime fear. So context matters, and it matters a lot. Then the other question that I have, and that I often pose myself in my research, is can data actually breathe life into the missing bodies it refers to? And if so, how? And I think here technology can potentially play a really important role, A, within data visualization practices, and B, by showing us alternative ways of counting. For example, there are many digital memorials as well, which add a more humane perspective to numbers, in my opinion. Many, plenty femicide memorials or killing memorials, transgender killing memorials. The other thing that I've learned so far is that practice of digital data activism and data contestation matter as well. And there's this 16th century proverb that says, "Nothing about us without us is for us." So in this way, feminicide has always been at the core of civil society. You know, in the 90s, women started counting bodies at the border themselves. So this practices of civil society in observing the state and how the state is rendering this problem visible has always been at the core of the feminist movement as well. This thought brings me to this other one, that we should remain very vigilant and question who counts and what is being counted or not, and try to go deep into the methodologies on the black boxes. This is hard, actually. To contest a statistic is hard because technical processes are difficult to understand. So it's easier to contest a human rights quote than to contest a number, because a number relates to so many practices that we find it hard to grasp. And when technology then intersects, it's harder as well, because that requires a certain level of expertise. Yet we should also ask what is being counted. And at the moment with COVID, I also think we should ask, what's the point of generating more data? Because we have a lot of data already. We already know patterns of violence. We already know that women are being killed. We already know that we need to invest in prevention. So the question here is, why do we need more data for? Another point is to bring in reflexivity at the core of our practices of knowledge production, regardless of where we are. And here I bring Ackerley and True. They have a really good essay on self-reflexivity in the academia. And they highlight some points, but I like to bring particularly three. The first one is the nexus power knowledge. So research processes reproduce power differences. And this is something that we have to be fully aware of. I mean, the institution I'm doing my research, for example, that has a burden and a weight in my research as well. And it's important to be open and to acknowledge that. The other one is boundaries, marginalization, and silences. So interrogate what we exclude or include from our own research process, and this is regardless of you doing data or not. And the situatedness of the researchers matters as well. Where are you, and who are you accountable for in your practices of producing knowledge? And then finally, I'd like to think of a world where we conceive or visualize statistics not necessarily from this tension between the micro and the macro, not to say, oh, let's focus on this tiny thing, or oh, let's try to create a general pattern, but rather to conceive these cases as an interconnected web. So here, what I've been thinking that could be a potential alternative into how we count would be to have a database where it's more of a network rather than a graph, where each case connects to the other in specific ways. So that trying to think about the case as a network is perhaps an alternative. Practices of commensurating, comparing, standardizing feminicide data, as I said, are both technical and social that need to happen collaboratively. This is why it's important to not only use one source or another source, but we can actually bring different sources together and try to compare them. And actually, I interviewed a really interesting statistician the other day who had a specific method where she brought together lists of disappeared people in conflict, different lists, and she tried to put them together into getting to know who was actually killed. It was a very interesting process. So we need to work on this collaboratively. And finally, I'd like to finish this talk with a piece from Walcott that I read recently, who has provoked a lot of thoughts in me. And this piece, which is called Data or Politics, Why the Answer Still Remains Political. He wrote more about race data in the context of Canada and COVID. But he asks, has more data actually led to better policies? And if I'm completely honest with you, I don't necessarily think so. I don't necessarily think that having and collecting more data on violence against women and girls since 2006 has actually reduced the number. This doesn't mean that it's more important. I'm not saying that we shouldn't. What I'm hoping to do is to try to question it more than to take facts for granted. And then he says, there is a gap between data collection, evidence, policy, and action, and that gap requires attention. It is the gap that represents a political question. And I think that's so true when we talk about femicide and femicide. And I often hear that it's very challenging to collect data on femicide, that it's a political term, that it couldn't fully translate into statistical frameworks. And I wonder if it's bias, or if it's or if it relates to patriarchy actually, and to the fact that there is still resistance in including and in counting and in categorizing. And by the political question, I mean we need, as I've been saying, to ask and question who's producing this knowledge, how this knowledge is being produced, and who are left out of this logic and practice of quantification. Thank you, and I'm open for questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Your memes, Saide, fantastic.
Yeah, they're amazing.
Thank you so much for this insightful talk. I mean, your brain must be going in a much quicker pace, I think, than at least mine, because the concentration and understanding everything you said, I think, was fairly hard. You're obviously super intelligent and have done a lot of good research on the topic. What I would say now is that we open the floor for questions, and I think before we do so, or no, I think I will actually keep it to after we had some questions. Just before opening up the floor, I have 2 questions, and then maybe Mimi has 2 questions. Wow, but it was so much, Saide, so I don't know even where to start. I wrote down like 100 things.
Sorry.
Should I start?
Well, yeah, you can also start. Maybe.
Because I have a definition question, which is maybe good to start with it. Because the term feminicido, it's also new for me. I just heard it a few months ago, and you talked more about killings from the state, and I also heard definitions which are more also going into structure, where you say that a feminicidio can also be when in a country abortion is illegal and women die from illegal abortion. Would you agree with that, or would you define it just for state killings, or I don't know?
It's been, if I'm honest with you, it's been really challenging for the Mexican state at least to be able to quantify, or to be able to create a full category of feminicide. And they've come in 2018. They came with 8 points of when a killing is a feminicide, because of course not all killings of women are a feminicide. Of course not. And the first parameter is the relationship between the victim and the perpetrator. So if there was already a relationship there, that is counted as a feminicide. The second one, if there's been sexual abuse and or violence prior to the killing, that is also considered a feminicide. The third one, if the victim has been incommunicated prior to the killing, so if she was kidnapped, this is also considered a feminicide. But for example, this question that you raised, if a woman died because of an illegal abortion, that was your question? Tamara?
I think.
Sorry. Yeah.
We were researching on is basically that feminicide emerges from inadequate provision of protection by the state. So basically, if a state can't guarantee that you have a safe abortion because insufficient health measurements or so, and you die from it, as a woman, is that feminicide?
I mean, I would say so, yes. But if I am using the Mexican parameters, I am not really sure if it would be considered as such. I mean, there is in one of the 7 points that I'm telling, if the victim was pregnant at the moment of killing, that is also considered a feminicide. So perhaps that could fall into that category, for example. But this is just the Mexican state. Each country of those 18 that have the typification of feminicide within their penal codes and legal codes have a different understanding, which is why it's so challenging to create comparison, even within the same country. Now, at the moment, interestingly, UNODC and UN Women are working on an international classification for criminal purposes, and they want to include feminicide. So they've been in consultation since 2019 on this process. They're inviting lots of civil societies and other organizations. So yeah, it depends on the state regulation.
But how do you think that, like, making the definition more global, like making it more comparable, would that even make sense? Because what you have been underlining is the cultural differences and different understanding worldwide about what is femicide, what kind of femicide emerges. I think from Verein Simone, now when we looked at femicide, it was pretty like obvious that honor killings, for example, take place to a greater extent in different kinds of the world, or dowry-related femicide, for example, is more present in India, and intimate femicide is obviously present everywhere. But how much sense does it make to comprise it into a global definition if the crime itself has different characteristics?
I think that's a question that I ask myself very often in my research: is what's the point, right? And why do we need a global comparison? What is this actually doing good or not? I think it is important to have the category included worldwide. And the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women initiative is to create femicide watches, which this is since 2015 she started saying this, to create autonomous, independent institutions in across the member states that collect data on femicide, of course, in partnership with people that are already doing this. However, I think like global bureaucracy, it's just massive. So I'd say that it's better to focus on the context, on the countries, and then try to see how to add up. Or the other possibility, and this is something that came with an interview, was to be able to communicate better how we communicate data. So rather than make it all encompassing, saying global, perhaps using other type of words to refer to the caveats and to the biases that often come with the data, right? So rather than saying perhaps global study on the gender-related killing of women and girls, it could be international comparison of intimate partner feminicide. So the title perhaps could be this, rather than telling us that there's giving something that in the end is different. Yet I certainly think that UNODC has done an incredible job, and because I've been, so I was way more critical before I started interviewing them, and then when I started to understand the processes around their comparison, it's immense the amount of work they're doing, and it's really challenging because they depend on administrative data from countries, and some don't really collect. But then again, what this produces is that they have really scarce data on Africa. So then is that global, or is it more a European comparison? So this is the thing. I think language and how we communicate data matters.
But when you say that the global bureaucracy is very complex, and I mean, we have from Verein Simone, we have been, when we talk about like legal regimes, for example, we have been talking about the Istanbul Convention, obviously something by the EU, or when we take our data, we have been taking it from violence against women, for example, or when we focus on like violence against women in Europe, it's also very Eurocentric. But so the question is like, I don't know how to put it the best, but is there even a possibility of going that far, or do we like need to keep it to the nation states? Do you know what I mean?
I think the European Union actually has really stronger statistical institutions, way stronger. They have way stronger. I interviewed a person that works for not the AHA, the European, can't remember the acronym now, but she works doing statistics in Europe. And the way they process the data, the way it's very different. I think I think it's a region that could closely come with a comparison if they are to include this category, which is not included yet. And I think there's a lot of reluctance. And the reason, I think, and some of my interviews have said this, and I agree with them to an extent, it's like, femicide is such a big and complex phenomenon. We cannot put everything in one. Like, it should be like the solution that someone offered me was, okay, let's try to bracket it down. So let's try to have one category, which is intimate partner femicide. The other one, that's dowry killing. Another one, infanticide. Another one, in the case of Mexico, for example, femicide in crime, femicide in conflict context. So to try to be more precise, rather than to say it's this big thing. It's the tension. It's like, do we go? Are we ambitious and try to be as precise as possible, or do we try to come up with something just to start the conversation?
I don't know if Mimi wants to, maybe you want to ask a question. I just wanted to shortly say that our hashtag of our organization is "We want to talk about it." So it's obviously creating a conversation about it. And maybe before Mimi has another question, we open up the floor. My last question would be, so you talked about the gap between the data collection and then the actual political will to comply with legal regimes that already exist. And we see a reluctance in European politicians to actually call the killing of women femicide. And we also see a reluctance and just a lack of knowledge about, for example, the Istanbul Convention, or like the judiciary in Germany, for example, has complained a lot about the fact that they aren't even what you say, lawmakers and judges aren't even as familiarized with the legal instruments they have on femicide. And for example, the Istanbul Convention isn't even used, even though it's there. There is no compliance with the law. And there I'm also questioning, like, okay, you can collect the data, as you say, and then what for? And then you can create the laws. But as you say, this gap that is there, as long as that's there and the political will isn't there, what use does it have? So the question would be like, what in your opinion, Saide, would contribute to close this gap? And maybe also for the people listening, because we're also recording it and posting it online, and I think it's many low-key civil society actresses that join us. What can we as civil society actors do to contribute to fight against femicide?
I think you have the advantage that we don't have, and it is that you have strong institutions, and you have institutions which you can, I mean, the European Union has so many pathways which you could go if you want accountability from your state, for example, or even from the region itself. So as I said in the presentation, and as you rightly mentioned now, civil society still plays a role. That's how it has moved in Latin America. Without civil society and without the feminist movements, we wouldn't be talking about femicide now. It has been relentless, honestly, relentless activism, particularly from mothers and from family members who have lost their daughters. I also think that the Latin American situation, particularly the Mexican one, is very, very different than how femicides occur within Europe. I think within Europe, intimate partner femicides do prevail way more than the killing in the public space of women. Again, homicide rates in Europe are actually decreasing, and public crime is also decreasing as well. So it is a very different understanding in both settings of what violence is, yet the patriarchal structure is the same overall, everywhere, right? Women are still dying at home more than men are dying at home. That's a fact, or not fact, but that's what some of the data has shown. And so I think, civil society and pushing and leveraging from within.
So a follow-up to that, if you say patriarchal structure is influencing it, what do you think? Do you think that capitalist countries that are more capitalist or more neoliberal does that also go hand in hand?
I think that's a challenging question, because I wouldn't say neoliberalism, like the more neoliberal a state is, the more women are killed. Like I think that rationale is incorrect. However, I do think that in the case of Mexico, for example, again, with the sign of the NAFTA agreement, this was the free trade agreement between Canada, the US, and Mexico, during the 90s, the moment where neoliberalism was at its highest. This was one of the problems that led to the killing of women at the border. Because what happened, I mean, this is a big context, but like I'll try to summarize briefly because I know that we're running out of time and people perhaps have questions. So when the NAFTA agreement was signed, the US said, excellent, then all of our production is going to move to the border to get cheap labor. So they started opening Levi's, shoe factories, all that started to open at the border. Women from peripheral states moved there to find a job. It also comes into a moment where women start to enter into the labor market and so on. And this was done in a very unprotected way, because then women were completely separated from their households, and they entered at 6 in the morning, and then their shift ended at 9 p.m. It was dark, it was the desert, and then the drug was also being traded at the border, and the border has always been a very, very conflicted geographical setting. So one could argue, yeah, neoliberalism in that way did affect the killing of women, particularly in this specific region. And also the inclusion of women into the labor market, which was also part of the neoliberal, the neoliberal political practices. This also made them more vulnerable because, of course, men were upset that then women were out and working. So the inclusion of women in the labor market in this specific region also was to the detriment of them. At the moment, honestly, we still don't know what happened in Juarez. We still don't know. There's been so many theories because hundreds of women started to be abducted from the public space, and their body was disposed also outside in the public space. Yeah, it was honestly, the Juarez situation was something very, historically it's also important because it met the 90s, the third wave feminism met with what was happening at the border. So this strengthened whole concept of femicide as well. Because, you know, like feminists from the US were looking at, okay, what's happening at the border, and lots of awareness. And this led to the International Court in Human Rights prosecuted the Mexican nation state in 2009. And then this, because of the killing of 3 women at the border, and then this led to, we wouldn't believe how many laws, resolutions, public policies, and so on. Is that decreasing the femicides in Mexico? Hard to tell, if I'm honest. But so to answer your question, sorry, I was just like talking, bringing all the things. But neoliberalism has influence, yes, but I'm not so sure if a neoliberal state itself puts women more in danger.
Yeah, I would say maybe we have some questions from the audience.
For those who don't know how it works, you just write in the chat.
Yeah, or you turn on your microphone if you want.
Yeah, you can turn on your
And
microphone.
if you want also your camera, then we can see you. That would be nice.
Aris hat eine Frage. You have a question, Aris. You want to turn on your camera again?
Yeah, you can write it and then perhaps Clara.
Yeah, you can write it
for us.
also, Aris. Are you writing, Aris?
You cannot see it on Zoom. You cannot see someone's writing.
While Aris writes, Saide, we had this.
Ja, ich würde gerne. I want to be online again with my video, but the host has blocked my video.
Yeah.
So, thank you. Yeah. Can you actually understand me? Hi. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Then my question would be like, since you said that collecting data is pretty like has started pretty recently, and I wanted to know if in especially Mexico, because you were talking mostly like a lot about this area, if the government there has reacted to the data that has been collected in sense of like women protection laws or like in any sense, yeah, in any way.
Oh yes, yes. There's been so much. There's been really, really so much. So since 2015, the prosecutorial office started to come with specific quantification of feminicide, and these reports are coming every month. So that has been really good, actually. The other difference is that the National Statistics Institute, INEGI, which is really good as well, they produce data every year. So it takes you a full year into the updates. Whereas the prosecutorial office, still don't know how to pronounce this word correctly, they're publishing data every month, but this is only data that with open files. So once you've denounced a case, the file is open by the Fiscalia, which I don't know what's the name of this in English at the moment. And then they present data on this plus emergency calls. They also include emergency calls into their data. It's very interesting. So since 2015, they changed the methodology of how they were quantifying to include a gender perspective. Oh, this is the other challenge, the gender perspective, because gender actually means things very different things in different states. And within the legal and the statistical frameworks, gender is always seen as difference. That is men, female, that's it, not as diversity. So a lot of transgender killings are left out. But then to respond to your question, I think there is will from some people in Mexico, certainly. However, it's very sad the response our current president has on this whole issue. He's denying it. He also blamed neoliberalism, for example, for the feminicides, with that the plain basic argument. And it's been very disappointing how he's responded. So in the past administration, there were loads of money for programs on violence against women and girls, for programs on feminicide. It was really poorly spent due to corruption. And in this administration, there's been severe cuts, and a denial of the situation, which has unnerved so many feminists who have relentlessly worked on this issue.
So in fact, there's a lot of data that's still like collected through like groups and like observance, but the administration right now is not really responding to it accordingly, like because of all these cuts.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Sadly. I mean, you have a thing in Mexico that's actually a very fascinating mechanism that's called the gendered violence alert.
Mm-hmm.
So when states start to have situations of extreme violence against women, the state gives them an alert. And it's a very institutional, I mean, in the end, it's not fully functional, but it has raised visibility in certain regions on the situation of violence. So, yeah, there are things going on, yet there's still a lot, because violence is multidimensional. It's not just one thing. It's not just the law. It's not just statistics. It's the cultural as well. And like when Gramsci talked about, I always say this like about what legitimizing an ideology means, and he always says that's changing hearts and minds. And it's not until you change that things will actually move forward. But even if there's just this thing about educating judges with a gender perspective, and we have hundreds of programs to educate someone that's responsible to prosecute a case, to give them a gender perspective. This means for the person to say, oh, this woman died because of this structural context, rather than, oh, she died because she was wearing a skirt, which is still on the mindset of so many people. So you train them, and they start to become aware of what gender is, of the gender structure, power imbalances. But if they don't fully agree with what you're saying, they will not change. If they still believe that a woman's place is the house, if they still believe that, then it's really, and the media, it's zero helpful. Like some of the things that are portrayed in the media in Mexico are just appalling. So we need a lot of will from many fronts.
Yeah.
Very multidimensional.
Is it also that why you said that you think that networks would be better than statistics, because they're also in more different areas instead of like collecting numbers solely?
I think the ideal would be like to have as much information as you could for one case, right? That's our dream. So if you have one case of femicide and then you have everything, you have the assigned sex at birth, then the gender, then the location, the perpetrator. Imagine like if you have the information of the perpetrator, age, oh, same thing, socioeconomic background, like as intersectional as you could. And that would be the dream. So if you have all of this in-depth information about a case, and then you could connect with others based on similarities.
Yeah.
Thanks for that insightful answer. Maybe Saide, do you have any more questions, Aris? Because we have a question in the chat otherwise. So the question is by Rodrigo, and he says, first of all, thank you for sharing your knowledge. It has been very illuminating. That's a very nice compliment, and I can just agree. Can you talk a bit more about your idea of a network-based visualization instead than just a number of days based data? Oh, okay, it was answered already, whatever.
Yeah. But this I take, maybe this is what to mention, like this I take a lot from STS studies, so science and technology studies, and how knowledge is more seen as a network, which includes non-human actors as well. And that has been, in my experience, also very insightful. So to become aware that in the process of making numbers, there are also other entities that play a role. So when I think about this idea of a network rather than a number, I can think of programs like Gephi or other, where the node, when you don't have any hierarchy, you know, when you just have like this big network connecting cases, and if you come close to a case, you know the information about this case, but you also know how this case is interconnected with this other case. But this is just it's kind of a dream I have of how data could be visualized, rather than me working on this at the moment.
Yeah, and talking about dreams, because I think we're a bit over time.
Yeah.
Now. Does anyone more have a question? If so, please raise it in the chat. And because it's within the scope of the 16 days against violence against women, against violence against women and Orange the World campaign, and this is rather, yeah, maybe a bit pessimistic, and like it's dark for all of us feminist activists, because we're confronted by violence obviously every day and sexism every day, but especially in these 16 days when you collect much information and you talk to people and you share it, it gets so much more present of how huge this problem is. And to get away from this pessimism and maybe end on a bit positive note, Saide, what would a gender equal world look like in your opinion? What would your dream scenario be? And yeah, how would such a world look like? Where are we going to be then?
Well, it's a hard question. I think a world where differences are not valued as a hierarchy, but rather accepted as such. You know, when you accept otherness, not vis-a-vis what you are, but just because they are. Just trying to conceive that otherness in such a way, rather than placing judgments or values, or saying that one is less than the other or one is better than the other. So more of a network, of a community, rather than a hierarchy, vertical.
And any last advice you want to give to the people that are listening to you right now, or to us as an organization?
I certainly think that technology and data activism offers a pathway of rendering otherness visible. And actually, there is now the MIT is working on a machine learning project to help data activists collect data. So they're training the machine learning to systematize content for them to be easier to detect the news reports, because sometimes they read, I mean, this work is so hard as well in terms of like care, because many are doing this on the side, it's unpaid, it's precarious, and they're constantly reading news about people getting killed in horrific ways. So there's a lot of vicarious trauma there for activists. And yeah, for example, like this idea that they're working on machine learning to help them process their data better. So there's hope of things being different or being looked at differently. and awareness and discussion and these spaces often help.
Thanks. And Mimi, you too. I think we as Verein Simone were very honored to have the possibility to talk to you, because we know you've been having a lot these last days. You also had a talk yesterday, and I think you have a lot of things coming up. But thank you for taking your time, Saide. It was really insightful and super cool to get the opportunity to talk to you and also get away a bit from Eurocentrism, I hope at least. But and
thank you very much for the invitation.
Continue talking to each other and sharing information. And maybe Mimi wants to say something, some last word.
I just wanted to say thank you also, and I really loved the acceptance of otherness as like the last words to say.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting because all the different events we have had, like on what is queer or feminism in art, etc. It often comes down to that point, like we should just stop labeling so much and just accept everyone for who they are and accept otherness. That's really true.
Good. Think about just web of connection. We are just conceive each other as webs rather than as hierarchies or verticalities.
So let's destruct hierarchies and let's deconstruct patriarchal structures. And continue our fight for gender equality.
Thank you everyone that came as well, rather than having dinner.
Julia and Hannah say that, and Diana also
thank you
for the talk and your efforts in research.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye. And thank you for having listened.